covered a lot of introductory, building them to a point where they're reading. I'd like to end with our last question, which again, when we're thinking the spectrum of K-12 and our learners, hopefully we get them to that goal where they're starting to read independently. Even if we listen to our students read, we require them to read to us. We know that some of our students read beautifully. But when we start to ask them questions around what they've read, or when we start to build some dialogue to get them to think about what they've just told us, what they've just read, there can be gaps in their comprehension. So what do you think would be some easy to do ways for parents to just kind of work that comprehension check and start to have conversation around the text that our students are reading?
Yeah, great question. I think one thing that as families, it's very easy to do is, Drew, you mentioned earlier around doing things like picture walks for the younger readers, but even with our older readers, I think there's benefit in sitting with our child, even just for 5 minutes. And even if they're reading a chapter book, they're not reading, a picture book, looking at things like the table of contents together and have them talk to you about simple predictions. What do you think is going to happen in this book that we're about to read, or that you're about to read? What do you think is going to happen? Oh, this chapter title says this. What do you think that might mean? Do you think something, what do you think might happen? And getting them to sort of start to think predictively. If we can get their brains sort of engaged with what is to come, it's going to give them kind of a task. Like, now I've got to really kind of pay attention to what's going on so I can see if I'm right. So that's a simple sort of way to sort of begin. But I also think for our students that, like you mentioned, that we have a lot of children that sometimes they equate reading with just saying the words on the page, and they may sound beautiful as they read. They may, sound quite fluent, and they might be reading very accurately. But the second that you pause them and you say, "Fantastic, talk to me about what you've read. Tell me about what happened here," and they go, "I don't know, I forget." We want to be able to help to build in them an expectation that reading is not simply saying the words on the page, that reading is all about making meaning. And so if we tell them ahead of time, hey, at the end of this picture book, at the end of this chapter, I would love for you to check in with me, and I want you to tell me a couple of things. And I think that depending on the type of book that they're reading, whether it's a fiction made up story or a nonfiction like informational text, there's a couple of different things you can try. When we're reading like a fiction type story that follows a very predictable sort of story structure, one thing you can have your children just tell them is be prepared to tell me a 5-finger summary at the end. Now, the 5-finger summary is very, very simple. It's just simply going to have your kids say, who are the characters? What was the setting? So where is the story taking place? And then you can either do like, tell me what happened in the beginning, middle, and end of the story. Or you can say, character setting, what was the problem that occurred?
Sure.
What was kind of the climax of the story? And then how was that problem resolved, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you could do that there. But that 5-finger retell can be really important because that gets the kids knowing ahead of time, oh, I've got to really be thinking while I'm reading this story. I need to be on the lookout. Like, who is in the story? Who are the characters? Where is the story taking place? What's the setting? What did happen first, next, and finally, right? So that could be a great ahead of time. If we tell the children ahead of time, be ready to tell me your 5-finger summary. If we were to look at, say, an informational text, and again, I'll go back to the very beginning. We mentioned the importance of letting your children take the lead as far as what they're most interested in reading, right? We want them to be reading things that are interesting to them, that are engaging to them. And if they have a special interest in something and want to read, like my son is a prime example of this. He's very into science, and he loves reading books about like children's books around like physics. Go figure. But that's what he loves. And so, I could have a conversation with my son, and I could tell him, when you're done reading this section or this book, be ready to tell me 3 cool new facts that you learned about this topic. I want you to teach me something. So after you've read this book or this chapter, I want you to teach me. What are those 3 most important facts that you learned, or the most interesting facts that you learned that you want me to know about? So that, could be something that you just sort of put in their head before they even begin to read, that will get them to be, oh, I have to pay attention. I've got to be thinking while I'm reading. So again, 5-finger summary becomes really great for those fiction stories, and for a nonfiction type of selection, more of an informational text. What are 3 amazing new facts that you learned, or the 3 most interesting things you want me to know about what you've just read, and then have that conversation with them.
Yeah, I love that you reference for informational text table of contents, because so many times before we read with a kid, we ask them, what do you already know about a subject or a topic, right? And asking them those types of questions to get them thinking about, and this is part of the reason why it's so important to draw off of their interests in the beginning, because their mind is already thinking about that subject, that concept. So one thing I always used to ask students to do when they looked at a table of contents is come up with a question that they think will be answered in that, based on that table of contents. And then I love the idea of, you teach me what you've learned, but I think maybe a way of taking that a step further when it comes to informational text is also like, what surprised you, or what was different from what you thought you were going to learn, or what you thought you knew that might have happened, or that you may have read on the page. Because oftentimes we think especially when we're reading about something we care deeply about, we think we know everything.
Right.
Sometimes there's that fact that we read that goes against what we previously thought, and that can be a huge talking point if we want to look at it like that.
Almost like, what was your aha moments?
Sure.
Yeah, love that. What surprised you? I love that. Yeah.
Statistics, right? We talk about numbers and stats inside of informational text too. And I know, again, when I was in school, but also when I was teaching, boys typically, as you said, your son, right? Like, they love the science, they love the social studies, they love reading about athletes. So statistics can be a real talking point. So those are all huge. I love the 5-finger retell. Is there maybe one other thing that we could potentially be doing with our students or our kids just when they're reading to help them to make connections?
Yeah, I think if you're reading with your child too, I think it's very appropriate to pause and sort of natural breaking points just to have a conversation about what's going on. And I think it's really important as a parent too, to model what's going on in your own head as you read. And as teachers, we call that thinking aloud. And for students to be able to, or children to be able to hear you say, oh my gosh, these characters were having a picnic in the mountains. And I remember a time that I used to do that. My grandparents used to take me up into the mountains, and we would camp and we would go on a picnic together, and it just made me feel so happy, or, whatever, just to sort of connect what's going on in the story with your own lives. And sort of the teacher speak for that would be a text to self connection, is what we call that. But there's multiple types of connections that you can model. Sometimes it might be a text to text connection. Oh my gosh, this reminds me of this other book that I read. Do you remember when we read the story together the other day? And do you remember what happened there? And, pausing to have those conversations. Another connection could be a text to world connection. So, something in the text is reminding you of something you've seen out in the world, or a movie you've watched, or, anything. And pausing to have those conversations when you're reading together is a nice model, because it's showing your students that you're thinking through the text and what's kind of going on in your head as you're reading as a proficient reader, right? And it's giving them that model and that language to help them to sort of start to make those connections as well. So having those conversations as you're reading together, I think is really an important thing to do, to not just sort of blitz through the whole chapter, but to pause once in a while and talk about, what do you think is going on here? Or, wow, this is making me ask a question. I'm really curious about why the character is doing X, Y, Z. What do you think? Do you have that question too? And, having those conversations, I think, while you read is another really big way to help support. We do think as we read, and the whole goal of reading is to make meaning. and to learn new things and to kind of experience things. So having those conversations throughout your reading of the text, I think, is really important too.
Yeah, I remember being in the classroom and when students would go to talk about a favorite movie, a favorite video game, I think naturally some of us want to direct them back to the text that we might be reading because we don't want them talking specifically about like video games, for example.
Right.
But I think it's so important, again, to maybe start with that, because if our students aren't given opportunities to talk,
right,
we know that it will ultimately impact even when they go to write. Their writing is going to be much shorter. It's going to be less detailed. We want to provide them with opportunities, again, almost tricking them, right? To just talk to me about how this video game is kind of like this book, right? And get them talking. And then we can move to some other things. But having them to make those connections, again, I think you mentioned it, but vocabulary that we see in two different places.
That's right.
See those connections. When they're thinking about comparing text to text, they've seen a character go through a problem. It will ultimately help that student to make maybe a more accurate prediction in the current story that they're reading. So having them make these connection points, I think, super important. Developing, their comprehension specifically. So I love all of those as well. Anything else that you think you wanted to throw out there for comprehension, or is that a pretty good start for our participants?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good start. But I will piggyback on what you said about making sure that your students, your children's interests are centered and are not pushed to the side when we're reading, because ultimately what we're all trying to do here is build our students into readers that love to read. That's the whole goal. We want our kids to love to read and to really embrace text and to find fascination in that and to be eager to read, to learn more about the world around them, and to make those connections through literature. And the biggest way to do that is to make sure you've got lots of buy-in. You want the kids to have that motivation. And so I think exactly what you said was right on target. Rather than redirecting and say, well, we're not talking about the video game right now. We're talking about this book. Let them talk about it, because they're able to then make some connections that are going to pique their interest, likely. Like if they're able to see some connections between things outside of books that they love and then inside the books that they love, they're much more likely to be motivated to read, to be more interested in spending that time in text, and to ultimately build their overall love of reading. So I wanted to just reiterate that again, because I think what you said was so on point and is really an important takeaway, I think, for families.
Yeah, and if I can also throw one more thing out there, I would say, and every teacher that's watching this would totally nod their head in agreement with me, but our kids often just pick up more of what they see us doing than if we're trying to walk them through reading a text. I will never forget seeing my dad every single night come home from work and after dinner reading the newspaper. And it sticks with those young minds that mom reads, dad reads, grandma reads, grandpa reads, to find out information, to enjoy a story, whatever it might be. But we also want to remember that, they're kind of taking cues from us. So even if we can shut off the TV, the computer, read a magazine, read a newspaper, any text.
Yeah, physical text. And I think you bring up such an important point, Drew. And I think you're right. I mean, what do we know about children? They're the great imitators, right? They're going to do the things that they see us doing. And so if we, even though in the current world where technology is so forefront and there's so much accessibility to e-newspapers and e-books online, and we have Kindles and we have tablets and we have phones, the seeing grown-ups that are important to them reading physical text is a very different thing than watching a grown-up who's looking at a phone and they don't know if we're playing a game, if we're on Facebook, or if we're texting somebody, or if we're watching a movie, or if we're reading something. And there's really no substitute for not only helping our children to learn to love to read and building that coziness and doing that read aloud with our children every day. But I'm so glad you brought this up, because seeing their caregivers, seeing their family members have some quiet time. Maybe there's some soft music playing in the background, but we're all going to just choose a book, a magazine, a newspaper, whatever it happens to be, and just read, because it's fun and it feels comfortable, and it's a way to either take a break from the stresses of life, or it's a time for us to, as you said, we're reading the newspaper, we want to learn about what's going on in the world around us, that there's really no substitute for that. And our children are the great imitators. So what they see us taking the time to do, they're going to do as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All good stuff as usual from you, Kelly. I thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. To everyone watching, I hope I certainly have learned, as I always do from listening to Kelly talk, but we hope you learned something that you can take away. Again, make it fun, use your imagination, try all of the activities and build on them. We wish you the best of luck, and thanks so much again for joining us.